And we are live. Today's show, I've got Mike Dasargo here. He's with Stronghold Dynamics. I'll put his information up here. Super duper appreciate you being here. Like I told you when we were waiting, we don't have like fancy intros or anything like
Yeah.
that. Super duper low budget here. But I'm going to let Mike introduce himself a little bit and talk about his company and anything else you want to add as far as intro stuff.
Sure. And I think it's all connected. I won't go too deep, but essentially, I grew up in a violent upbringing, not the best
Yeah.
childhood, experienced violence on many levels. And in my teens, started studying martial arts, and it was Chinese martial arts, this kind of stuff that usually gets clowned, right? And for not working. But for whatever reason, whenever I started that, it doesn't work, right? But my instructor, Tony Puyo, he retired Chula Vista detective. Both he and I are able to experience violence and still recall some of the skills and techniques that we practiced in his garage, essentially, right? And as I became an instructor, I found it exceedingly difficult to reproduce the success in students. And that came from the old mantra of rehearsal mastery, right? We used to think of that as absolute, that if someone isn't able to apply a skills because they haven't practiced enough, so maybe do it 10,000 more times. The whole Bruce Lee adage, feel the man and kick a midget. But I'm sure that's how the quote goes. But in any case, it's not valid, right?
Yeah.
Going to help us.
And that's a lot of the reasons why I wanted to have a conversation with you. I met you. I've known about you for a while. You're kind of one of the very first humans that was around with Pincus when there was a transition from the military stuff out in Telluride, Colorado, if I'm not mistaken. Or were you involved in that stuff as well?
I
Or
was
no?
I was not.
Yeah. So you
I'm
were
also
kind
not
of
human. I'm Palladian. I'm kidding. I'm joking.
uh, and so you were there with combat focused shooting, and then
Yeah.
the transition a little bit.
Hmm.
And it's maybe transition's not the right word. Evolution is
Yeah.
probably a better word.
Hmm.
From combat focused shooting to intuitive defensive shooting. And you have this desire, this love, passion. Maybe I'm wrong about it, but it seems like you've got a passion for the neuroscience. I one of your articles I reference a lot in classes when we talk exactly about what you said is this one that you have at personaldefensenetwork.com. If you guys haven't checked it out, if you have missed the many times that I referenced it, I encourage you guys to go check that out. The paradox of perfect practice, the role of contextual interference in performance improvements. I highly recommend that article. I've been doing these series of videos, how to choose a gun in neuroscience, and everything that I talk about in these videos, it's focused on science. I love physics. Me personally, I love physics. The brain interests me, but it's not a passion. It's not it's fascinating to talk about the limbic system, but I think physics to me is what neuroscience is to you. And maybe I have it wrong, but I at least I believe it based off of the videos that you've made, the articles that you've written. So expand on that a little bit more, maybe about the article or the stuff that you were already going into with the martial arts anyways.
Yeah. No, I appreciate you throttling me back because I'll just let it go. So I'm glad
No,
you saved it
do
for the
it.
show.
Do it.
Yeah, I met Rob. It all ties in because it started with trying to improve my ability to transmit capability, right? Like I didn't understand how I can get in fights or whatever my instructor
Yeah.
could get in fights, but we had difficulties producing that in students. And so that became a relentless pursuit, because ultimately my students are my responsibility. They're trusting me to keep them safe by the things that I'm teaching them, right? And so I needed to figure it out. Studied kinesiology, went purely down the mechanical path, things that are popular in competition shooting. That whole premise is the path that I was on. And so a lot of times when I talk about mechanics, when I discount the idea of dry firing 1,000 times, when I discount technical perfection, coming out of the holster fast and shooting straight. When I discount all of that, it doesn't come from a place of ignorance or bias. It comes from a place of learning. I've learned beyond that because I've spent a minimum of a decade, trying to figure that out. I do have in the article, I do mention Amanda Tornhill, who was the first person to turn me on to the neuroscientific side of things, at the schemas and how the brain categorizes or catalogs, I should say, different memories and how we recall those memories, and particularly how certain neurochemicals impact our behavior. And he's one that really blew my mind in the sense that when I went through the process, he has this thing called a simulator, and it simulates the physiological impacts of stress, of traumatic stress, particularly. We always have this hyper realistic training with blood spilling out, or like spilling out Hollywood blood. I forget what it's
Yeah.
called. And simulating the external environment. He took it a step further and wanted to ensure, because you could always peek behind the curtain and tell yourself
Right.
this is just a drill, and really not, because people are afraid of fear, right? They're afraid of panic. They're afraid of that. But in the training environment, we got to figure it out, see who we really are. Who am I really? When we talk about training for the worst case scenario, but then when we train, we often picture ourselves as a hero, right? Doing everything perfectly. Now, the idea is to execute as near to perfect as we can, but we have to accept that perfection is kind of chasing the dragon. But ultimately, the true worst case scenario is when things are unexpected, both in the context of scenario, but including in certain emotions that you haven't felt before, certain things that you might have to process. So, with that in mind, I kind of wanted to make sure I preface everything, even though we're going to pinpoint neuroscience. I'm at a place now where in a 2-day training class, there's only so much that we can do to prepare a student. So
Yeah.
there's some direct action things that we can do to enable a student to prepare for traumatic violence. But there are other things that we can do to enhance the system, because it's not a thing that happens in isolation. It's a multifaceted experience. Ultimately, when people say, hey, what's your background, right? Because they're trying to qualify
Correct.
whether or not you're able to actually teach this information.
Correct.
What they're really asking about, because I always say, look up my LinkedIn profile, right? Because it's we tend to associate law enforcement or military as more
Correct.
qualified. What they're really trying to figure out is, do you have firsthand experience with violence in the context of the things you're teaching? So when we peel that back, then we really have to ask the question, what is an experience and how do we replicate these highly dangerous scenarios in a safe training environment? How
Correct.
close can we get to being downrange without actually having a threat of death, right? How much can we induce the threat of death without that risk actually present? And beyond the physical mechanics, beyond the physical techniques, is the ability to process information, but not just process information, but do so while under the influence of the psychological impacts. Uh-oh.
Yeah. No,
Okay.
no, you're good.
Gotcha. Wasn't sure if I lost the connection there.
No.
Um, there's certain psychological impacts and an emotional valence that happens. And we'll get into all of this when we talk about the body's natural reactions. But kind of want to preface it with, do you game at all, or do you have at least played Street Fighter back in
Yeah,
the
yeah. I mean, I'm
90s?
not, I'm not a gamer per se,
Right, right.
but yeah, yeah, for sure.
So this is going to sound a bit off the handle, but there's more evidence to support that consciousness is the result of our brain receiving a signal rather than generating consciousness. All right. There's no
Say,
solid
say,
physics.
so break that down
Yeah.
for you're talking to an ESL Mexican.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
white people words escape me sometimes, so break that down a little bit more for me.
It's gonna be a new label, man. I got to throttle back my white people words. But people typically talk about our soul, right? When we talk about consciousness and our awareness of things, right? Um, the best way I could describe it is maybe our soul, why we're alive. How are we different from a rock, right?
Yeah,
Because we have conscious awareness, but there's different levels of consciousness. And right now, neuroscientists, the best guess is that it's a correlative um, premise that we see brain activity and we think that that brain activity produces consciousness. But there's near-death experiences where they gather this data from people who've died on the table from heart attacks, where they're flatlined, they're dead, they come back, and they're able to describe the environment and things that actually happened when they were technically dead. And so there's many documented cases like that show that our consciousness isn't generated by the brain, but the brain receives it like a radio signal, right? And so essentially, if
Got it. Got it. I mean, and that's interesting because I mean that's proven in many areas, right? Where
yeah,
it's electricity, right? Like they
yeah,
have to insulate it so it doesn't get
yes,
interfered by
yes.
other stuff. Yeah, yeah. That's just
There's-
basic science where
yeah,
it's energy, right? Like
yeah.
at the end of the day, it's just energy. Yeah,
There's going to be quite a bit of overlap with physics as well. That's why I had a huge
has
smile
to
on my
be,
face. Yeah,
has to be.
yeah, because our the way we process time, which is going to be distorted under stress, we call it tachypsychia or
Take
slow
a second.
motion time, right?
Yeah,
That's kind of the proof of concept that time isn't what we think it is. We just process things linearly in 3 dimensions, but time really is fourth dimension. And going too deep into physics won't go, but you know what I'm talking about, where
yeah,
um, events and things happen everywhere all at once at the same time. But we just process it in a very linear level.
yeah,
And when we get into the body's natural reactions, that we'll get into that impact and the survival positive of how it changes. But essentially, we only pay attention to what's biologically useful. And so, for the
yeah.
most part, like we're getting bombarded with signals. So, right now, people are paying attention to the screen, they're listening to your voice, my voice, but you've been wearing your shirts all day. And it's not until I bring up the texture of the t-shirt on your skin that you bring your attention to it and you start to notice how the fabric feels
Correct.
or how the chair feels under you as you sit on it.
Yeah, in
All these
physics,
signals.
there's this thing very similar to that. In physics, there's this. It's hard to explain at a very basic level, but like this idea that we don't actually feel wet. Like wetness
Right.
is not something we actually feel. It's actually that it's more the coldness. It's the change of temperature that we're experiencing more than it is actual wetness, and it's very difficult to explain. We give it a word
Hmm.
just because it's easier to just say it's wet
You're right. Right.
than to understand. So it's
Yeah.
interesting that in the brain it happens very similarly to that. You had mentioned, and I don't want to divert you too much,
Hmm.
but you
Hmm.
had mentioned simulation,
Yep.
and I we've made videos about this. I've talked about this, but I want to have an outside perspective. And when I say outside, you and I, we're adjacent, right? We
Yeah.
don't work together. We don't. You're not guns for everyone. I'm not that type of stuff. So I think humans to the point of the brain is like, what do you actually know? Is just like I think it's good to have people from outside of your organization come in and kind of either verify or shut your shit down, one of the two.
Right.
And we talked about simulations a lot. I don't like simulated trading in the traditional sense.
Yeah.
Put up a screen
Oh,
or
right.
set up a restaurant
Yes.
scenario.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's at the end of the day, it's useless because it doesn't really do the civilian any justice. Maybe on the offensive side, it might do something, but on the civilian side, it doesn't. I don't know if that's where you were going, or if that's what you were talking, or
Sort of, but that's actually a great conversation starter if we identify why you don't like it. What is it that's missing? Because I think that brings us to the solution.
well, it goes from the actual surprise,
Yeah.
and now you're anticipating a
Yep.
threat. So
Yep.
now your brain
Yep.
is prepared for the threat. So it's not a real
Yeah.
threat
Right.
because you know it's
Right.
there. Like
Right.
if you told me, this is what I always argue when I show up to, I've done simulated training,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
they tell me, "Oh shit, pick this one. This one's an active shooter." I was like, "So I know there's an active shooter."
Right. Right.
If I
Right.
go to Walmart and the security guard there's like, "Hey, there's an active shooter in there," I'm gonna be like, "Yeah, I'm gonna go to Target really quick. I'm not gonna be at Walmart. Like, I'm gonna
Yes.
fuck off,
Yes.
and I'm gonna go somewhere else." So
Yeah.
that's why I don't like it. I think if done correctly, maybe you can get
Yeah.
some value out of it,
Absolutely.
mechanically, but not psychologically.
That's it. You hit it right on the head. That's it. So that's why most force on force and most simulations fail because they're shallow. and what they're perceiving to be a simulation. It's a very shallow, there's no other way to say but piss poor simulation, right? Because of those facets, right? So
Yeah.
anticipation, it's difficult to get students in the right frame of mind because we have a propensity to try to anticipate and game it because we want to do our best, right? And so in some simulations we'll talk about suspend disbelief that you're on a square range and that this is a real thing. So right off the bat in some of our training programs we're trying to address the psychological component. Something I don't do that the founder of Taurus, who has the simulator, you peel back, what are the impacts of psychology, what are the impacts of emotional valence, and how can you improve the precision of simulation when you understand those mechanics. And so what he's done is he looked at norepinephrine, and we're going to go into that with the body's natural reactions, and produced an exogenous, that's a white people word, which means it's from outside the body, right? It's not, because our bodies produce adrenaline, but when we game it, and we know that it's an active shooter, it doesn't take us by surprise. We don't get that spike. We don't get the amygdala getting that surprise of the unexpected and the associated sudden dump of the adrenaline and cortisol
Correct.
and all those neurochemicals.
And
So
this
he,
is all. I did have a video. I just want to point people
yeah,
to videos that I've made. I did make a video, a very basic intro level to how the thalamus hypothalamus works, how the amygdala works, how the hippocampus works, and how that all sends chemical signals to the adrenal glands, and basically start sending out proteins to various parts of the brain and shit like that. So
yeah.
if you haven't watched it, go watch it. But go for it. Sorry.
No worries, man, no worries at all. But that's the significant flaw with what people consider force on force
Yeah.
or simulations, and they just kind of cop out because people want to feel good at the end of the training,
Yeah.
and rarely do people actually want to experience some level of bad feelings. Right, as
Yeah.
tough guys as we are, we don't want to experience the sensation of failure. We don't want to experience the sensation of fear. But that's where emotional functioning is a paramount aspect of improving your ability to process information, because emotions can be a distraction, right? They can absolutely serve as a deterrent to your ability to process information. Say if you got stabbed a couple of times,
Yeah.
you might start taking inventory about what might happen, right? Because you're
Correct.
losing so much blood. So now you're distracted while the fight's still in progress, right? And so there's a movie called Inside Out, and it's a brilliant movie that talks about neuroscience for kids. It's a kids movie, but I think adults should watch it.
Correct.
Um, and they talked about fear protects you from what you can see, anxiety protects you from what you can't. And so the idea is that there's
Yeah,
anxiety.
because anxiety is basically just fear, reimagined to a certain
That's it.
degree.
That's it.
Yeah.
Trying to anticipate the future,
Yeah.
calculate the future, or dwelling on something that already happened. But
Correct.
it's not in the now. It's not in the present,
Correct.
right? It's not a reality in the current moment. It's calculating a few steps too far forward or a few steps back without really addressing the immediate needs now, which is why the old adage in some high-speed units would be just put in a box because we don't have time to deal with that right now.
Yeah.
But that becomes mentally unhealthy. It destabilizes you and actually it has some function, but its long-term side effects is a net negative, right? And
Yeah.
so there's a healthier way to process your emotions, and it's through emotional functioning. Um, it detects changes in your environment before you actually are aware of why you're feeling that way. I mean, that's part of how the amygdala triggers that body's natural reaction. So um, I keep going back to BNR, so I might as well start talking about it a little bit.
I'm
But
gonna put it up.
yeah,
I didn't. If you want to talk about it and
sure.
correct anything that I may have wrong, I presented it and I found one potential error in my PowerPoint presentation. But again, if you wanna, I'm gonna put it up there and feel
Cool,
free to have a conversation about it.
cool.
Um,
Awesome. So this is up there for reference for people who have split attention like I do. But ultimately, the way we want to think about it is that the nervous system does the sensing. There's things that happen when we were talking about attenuated signals, right? We're getting
let
bombarded with
me,
signals all the time, and that's the nervous system. But it's
yeah,
the mind that does interpretation. but it's a bit more complex than that because things happen at a far more rapid pace than a higher order thinking can keep up. So
Correct.
essentially, when there's a threat that's detected, it'll trigger an emotion, typically a fear response or a panic response that you're about to get killed. And that cascades into it triggers the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the adrenal glands, the HPA axis to produce uh, catecholamines, which is essentially survival serum. It's a neurochemical cocktail that changes the system. The reason why I brought up the gamer thing earlier is before you play a game, like in Street Fighter, you have different characters. We have Ryu, you have Dhalsim, you have Bison, and they all have different unique functions, different attacks, defense, and supers, for lack of better words, right? And I think when it comes to training, we kind of limit ourselves to specific functions and don't really take the broad spectrum functionality of the human potential. When it comes down to not just the technique, but ability to process information, the impact of psychology, and all of that, right? Psychology, including the emotional valence side of things. And so the amygdala will trigger that cascade of survival serum. And the ones that are particularly interesting, there's Dr. Huberman has what he calls the arrow of focus. And it's three neurochemicals. It's going to be acetylcholine, which is like the arrow, and that directs your attention at the specific thing. So when there's a threat, you'll get that dump of acetylcholine, you look directly at it, right? The adrenaline, specifically the neurotransmitter norepinephrine, is what provides the energy, the boost in the system to pay attention to that thing. And it's the dopamine that acts like the tail of the arrow that stabilizes the flight for sustained and extended focused attention on that thing. Now that's could be problematic. We're going to come back to that when we talk about fixation, particularly after you've had to stop a threat, right? And so you have this arrow of attention. And on the external factor, what happens is we orient to that threat. We get that rise in visual acuity in the center field of vision to collect more information, right? And so we turn, there's a psychological orientation. It's just not a physical orientation where you're just turning your head to it. That's so that you can see it, but the psychological orientation to it is there as well. So I'm going to come back to that when it comes down to problem solving fixation, because when we orient to something, we tend to get stuck on that thing, and that has to do with dopamine. Um, the What happens in the brain is that your prefrontal cortex and your visual processing center does get that dump in neurotransmitters where we start to experience slow motion time. And the best analogy I have for it, for those that are old enough to watch VHS or maybe even a streaming video, if you have a slow motion feature on it, you're watching it in regular time, but the way you're processing information, it seems so slow, right? If you listen to a podcast and you put it on a slower pace, then it seems like it takes forever to get to the point, kind of like my rambling sometimes, right? But what that does, it affords you the ability, more time to figure it out. Things are happening in slow motion. I have a favorite anecdote. I know we don't teach by anecdotes, but people who experience car crashes often report
Yeah.
getting details or it happens in slow motion. I was a bouncer at a club called Aubergine. There was like a big old 9 foot, 10 foot Sasquatch of a dude. He was probably 30 feet, to be honest. But I remember it popped off. We got tangled up. He was much bigger than me. And at the time, I didn't know any grappling or jujitsu. And we started falling. And I remember having enough time to think, oh, this is bad. I need to figure this out. If he lands on top of me, I'm pretty much done. Let me turn my hips, maybe collapse his trachea a little bit with my hand to orient his shoulders and slam him on the ground and hope that he doesn't get up. Like I had a full-on conversation. I
Yeah.
distinctly recall like going through these thought processes from the moment of both of us losing balance to the point of hitting the ground. But that's a common phenomenon that happens with all across the board, and it affords the opportunity to feel like we have more time to figure it out. Right, it's a
Correct.
huge survival positive. The survival positive of the rise in visual acuity in the center field of vision. Most people think it's tunnel vision, and that's
Correct.
the only thing that you can see, right? But what it actually is narrowed attention. We still have peripheral vision, and it's really changes in light that we detect as motion.
Yeah.
So,
This is where it gets very difficult for me to convey.
right.
This is I have the same issue with physics, right? So like if we say gravity, we all talk about gravity the same way our second grade, third grade teacher taught it to us and stuff like
Yeah.
that. But it's much more complex than that, right? Like it's the curvature of space time. It's the mass. It's really not a force. It's so complex. So a lot of the times I tell students it's tunnel vision and we're losing peripheral vision, but like and that's the point is like we really don't. But it's just you have your rods that, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, but you have your rods that are responsible for grayscale stuff. So the wavelengths that are coming into your eyes are coming in differently than they would before. So now the color looks. This is why you can't tell if it was a gray jacket or a purple jacket or anything because that's not important. Your brain,
Yes,
I don't give a
that's
fuck about that.
right. Exactly. And so it's a matter of attention and prioritizing what's biologically useful. And in this extreme circumstance, the most biologically useful thing is stopping the thing that's trying to stop your biology. Right.
Yeah,
And so the attention to detail isn't relevant. You know, when we talk about auditory exclusion, there's certain
yeah,
sounds. But the amazing thing that happens oftentimes is the brain still catalogs the most important sounds. And usually it's going to be the threat is making the most important sounds. That's what you need to collect information on.
yeah.
However, there's many case studies about people who only heard the threat and then heard their kid calling. Right? They might not hear cops giving them orders, but they hear the sound of their child's voice or
Now,
their parent's voice.
do you think that has a lot to do? I don't know how deep into this you've studied this, but are plenty of studies exist out there. So I encourage people that are watching this to go check it out.
Yeah.
Plenty of studies for the to support the idea that your brain just makes shit up. Like it's filling in the gaps.
Yes.
It already knows what this wall looks like.
Yes.
So it's just filling it in. It's kind of like a cache for your cache, however the fuck people
Yeah.
say it for your computer. Like it's already there.
Yes.
My eye is actually not seeing the wall right now that's behind this computer. Like my eye already knows, my brain already knows what the fuck it looks like, so it's overlaying it
Yeah.
to kind of. It's fucking weird.
Yeah.
Just because we have a natural blind spot and all that stuff. So is it because of that? Because I know what my kid hears and sounds like when they're crying. So like
Yes.
it's
Yes.
I don't know. Not too many of us know what a cop sounds like
Hmm.
giving us commands. Like I
Right.
can't pre-fill that shit in.
Right. And that kind of goes back to the neurochemical cocktail as well. Um, and yeah, it's a great point because there's a couple of different points I want to hit with that.
Yeah, go for it.
Um, the how the brain catalogs what's important, right? And so it's usually a parent's voice or a child's voice is going to be critical for survival. It's cataloging that way. So if you hear your child suffering, immediately everything that'll be the most interesting thing in the room, potentially, right? I can't say anything with absolutes,
Correct.
but the what you talked about with anticipation essentially is what happens when we make things up because we're putting two and two together, and anticipation helps us take heuristic shortcuts about things. And so the downside to that is something called change blindness. And that's how our brain only pays attention to what's most relevant and deduces everything else. And that can have a drawback because that's how you get pickpocketed. That's how certain things can change without you noticing. There's an amazing video called The Invisible Gorilla, right?
Yeah,
And a lot of people know to look for the gorilla,
correct.
but you take the concept and you put another layer to it, you might see the gorilla, but you're going to miss other things. You're going to
Correct.
miss, it's going to be change blindness, and that has to do with how we manage our attention, right?
Yeah.
And so the, when
And this is
people
why
are
it's a myth to be aware 100% of the time. Like
absolutely, man.
you should always be aware 100% of the time. Like, how do you tie your shoes? Like
Yeah, yeah,
how do you hold your kid's hands? How do you enjoy your kid at the park? Like it's just so
that's it.
stupid.
Especially in executive protection, because oftentimes there's one man details, and also the agent in charge has to multitask. They have to make phone calls. They have to look at their phone, right? They can't always be surveying for threats. And it comes down to, instead of talking about mindset, having the right mindset, because
Yeah.
mindset means your mind is set. It's about mind state and being fluid, having cognitive flexibility, exercising flexibility in the mind. And this kind of brings us all back to tunnel vision, right? Because it's about managing attention. So when people are afraid of tunnel vision, it's really fixation that we're talking about. This
Yeah.
goes back to peeling back the layers of what's really problematic with simulations, what's really problematic with tunnel vision. Tunnel vision is a survival positive. You don't need to pay attention to all that other stuff. You need to pay attention to this right here and now. So how do you manage that? And the priority is it's typically a proximal threat, right? And so we'll typically get fixed on what's closest to it. So what's the immediate
Yeah.
threat? The downside, what happens is after you've addressed that threat, now the danger of um, dopamine seduction comes in because it's a highly emotionally valent event. Maybe you're pissed off at the dude, or maybe you've never seen what it's like to have gurgling blood coming out of someone's
Correct.
mouth or things like that. There's all this new traumatic information coming in, right? Um, earlier we talked about rods and cones, right? And so it's all about picking up light. The cone is a flat surface; it doesn't pick up. I'm sorry, and the cone picks up more light because of its shape, right? And so it gets more detail. And so it's not that the signals aren't coming in, right? The sound. It's not that the sounds aren't coming in. There's a little of a protection mechanism to protect your hearing somewhat, but it's completely inefficient, right? It's not like go train without earplugs so you get used to
Right.
gunshots. No, that's called hearing loss, bro.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not what happens. You don't hear it because it's the same thing with change blindness, right? There's something more important that you don't pay attention to how loud the sound is, so you don't notice it. It's not that the sound isn't getting in. It's not
Correct.
that light isn't coming in. It's that they're being attenuated or suppressed, right? And so after stopping a threat, what people get wrong about multiple target engagements is that they overvalue how fast you can transition from target to target. The true value of it is training cognitive flexibility, because while all our senses are hyper focused and fixed on what just happened, the habit of physically turning your neck starts to put in different light into your eyes, and that could start to help change your attention from what's happening there. But what happens is we see this happen all the time on the range is a lot of times people get fixed on the dopamine of how well or how bad they did on the target, on a paper target. So they'll turn their head but not notice anything because their psychology is still fixed and they're still
Correct.
thinking about whether they hit the shot or miss the shot, right? So the true value of that is that cognitive flexibility, making sure they break their attention away from that. And what can happen is I kind of have this telescopic vision where things get magnified when we look at it under stress.
Yeah.
And as we turn our head and we pay attention to other visual cues, that can help us shift and change our attention so that we become less focused on that stimuli.
Yeah.
And that actually has a neurochemical impact on the machine where we start to metabolize things a little differently as don't want to go too deep into like cortisol and all the different enzymes. But as we start paying attention to other things, that stimuli triggers different neurochemical reactions,
Correct.
right? So it's extremely important to not get so fixed on how fast you could just transition from one target to the other, but how well you can change your attention. That's the focus of multiple target engagements, is looking at other things. And intuitive defensive shooting, we task the student with looking for anyone that can help, who else needs to be shot, who don't want to get shot by. These are guidelines that can have an immediate impact on a student's ability and their brain structure as well. That
Yeah.
cognitive flexibility, right? That after I shoot, I need to maintain that cognitive flexibility and start looking at things that are happening around me, not at inanimate objects, but things that are actually happening. Is my
Correct.
classmate reloading? Is my instructor doing something silly? Is there a stripper on the range that's a midget? Is there like looking up on the mountainside of a mountain? Is there a freaking Harris hawk that just captured an illegal immigrant? I don't know, but
Correct.
all these random things. We need to exercise cognitive flexibility. I believe that that's a true value of multiple target engagements. This whole thing with going from one target to the next as fast as you can, it's important, but not as useful as your ability to process where that other threat went and then pick it up and then engage and apply those physical skills with speed.
Correct.
And so,
Yeah. The same thing happened with the student clear malfunctions.
yeah,
You're doing the non-diagnostic linear malfunction drill,
yeah, yeah.
going through that, and then you'll occasionally get one student who's stuck on the idea that, well, I know what the failure is.
Right.
Yes, but that's not what we're working on right now.
Yeah,
You're trying to combine two separate issues,
yeah.
the psychological and the mechanical. We need to have the brain on.
Yeah.
I heard something. I felt something. So I need to do the mechanical thing to solve the problem.
Yeah.
Not, well, I know what it is, so let me look at it, and it like you're not going to be there.
Right. And knowing what it is isn't relevant to the solution. Right.
Correct.
And so all we need is just to apply the solutions, and we don't need to waste bandwidth. And ultimately, I think that's something that's lost on the square range, is really understanding that everything's competing for your attention. And we need to train our mind to focus on the threat. Like, that's the most important thing. And on a square range where we know that it's training, we have to will ourselves to do it. But in an actual critical incident, it's not going to be your choice.
Yeah.
Right? It's going to be compelling. I think there was an instructor, probably know who it is, that will throw rocks at the student, and you'll like, the student will get surprised. I mean, it's not to hurt them; it's just like tiny pebbles just to get their attention. And you'll
Correct.
see them look up and get distracted by it, and then it's just a pebble, right? And that's
Yeah.
kind of proof of concept that, look, there's other things that are more distracting than looking at a stovepipe. When you just look at all the different problems with a malfunction, the solutions
Correct.
are going to be tap rack for a vast majority of it. Not, then learn how to reload and clear, or clear and
Correct.
reload, depending on the circumstance, right? But
Yeah, but it's that interesting psychological dynamic of um and very difficult to a certain degree to impart on students when you're telling them, like, I get it, this is a very controlled environment, you know how to solve the problem, but you're missing out on the psychological effects that's going to happen in real life. This is why we don't
yeah,
worry
yeah,
about looking at the gun. Tachypsyche is why you don't worry about looking.
yeah,
Proprioception is why you don't want to look at the gun.
yeah.
um
And on that point, I just have to interject for a second. Sorry for cutting you
yeah,
off,
yeah,
but I
go
think
for
it's
it.
important to note that the way that norepinephrine, the neurotransmitter, interacts with the brain doesn't necessarily impact your sense of feel, right? And so we have alpha and beta receptors that they either constrict or dilate, meaning they either shut it off,
Yeah.
trying to use non-white people words, or they
you're
open it
you're
up.
you're good. I'll let you know when that just confused
Okay.
the shit out of me.
All right.
Most of the time I'm doing all right.
All right. But yeah, it changes blood flow, right? And so, like with the extremities, it'll shunt, right? It'll the smooth muscle will shut off, so it squeezes the blood to the large muscle groups. That's something that confuses people quite a bit, right?
Yeah,
So
that's
same
this
thing.
last one that I have here.
Yep, that's it. So there's that always confuses people because there's an increased blood flow to the large muscle groups. So does it increase blood flow or does it reduce blood flow? Well, it depends on what part of the extremity, right?
Correct.
So the large muscle groups versus the smaller muscle groups. As far as loss of sensation, there's a difference between well, tactile sensation is a part of proprioception, but there's a sense of pressure, right? And
Yeah.
so people are concerned about wearing gloves because they can't feel things. Well, surgeons wear gloves all the time, right? Because you can feel the pressure. It's a deeper sensor that's
Yeah,
deeper
but
than the surface skin.
yeah, proprioception in the sense of like your body's just aware of what the fuck's going on around your area, right?
Yeah,
It's why you don't have to look at the buttons on that to fucking to play a game. It's why
yeah,
I can scroll most of the time without looking at my mouse and stuff like that.
yeah. And that has to do with your musculoskeletal system.
Correct.
In it, you have this thing called a GTO, or a Golgi tendon organ, and it
Hmm.
detects changes in lengthening and tightening, and then it indexes that space that we can sense. So we could high five
Right.
ourselves, we could wipe our butts without looking at our butthole, kind of thing, right? So it's a magical thing, right? We can index
Yeah.
all that. And so what happens under stress is that proprioception becomes more reliable because that part of the brain isn't under the same amount of time distortion influence as the visual processing center. And the
Yeah.
case in point behind that, and the higher order thinking centers, you see it happen all the time in MMA, where a fighter will be concussed, but they'll still very skillfully grapple with the referee.
Correct.
Freaking awesome. I love it every
Yeah.
time that happens, right? You don't need the higher order functioning for the automated proprioceptive based skills to
Yeah.
apply reliably. And that's the main point I like to drive home when it comes to emergency reloads and non diagnostic linear malfunction drills.
Yeah, I think I did a poor job at talking about this in a video. Is the merging of the automated and the automatic and your sympathetic movements. The reason we go to the range is not just to go shoot bullets. That's awesome, but you're not really building any automated stuff into your brain. Or that is the automated. When shit hits the fan, you just grab the gun and you shoot 17 times for no fucking reason. That's because
Right.
that's what your brain has, your quote unquote muscle memory has filed in as this is what we do when we use a gun. We just shoot 17 times for no fucking reason. Um,
Yeah. So you're talking about range habits? Kind
yeah,
of thing?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Training scars and things of
Yep.
that nature.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah. So there's certain cues, right? And again, that's another complex issue because how can we say that don't do a certain thing because you won't do that in a real fight, but in a real fight we get guys like doing weird things with the revolvers. Or
Correct.
I know of a guy that was telling me about the old when they're a sniper in Marsoc, that they had the habit of catching their brass after taking a precision shot. They just couldn't get rid of it, kind of deal. So there's different signals, different cues that provoke different actions, right? And
Yeah,
so the larger thing that we're concerned about is certain contextual information that impacts our behavior, that changes everything, right? And so it comes down to risk. And so um, I just mentioned this on my gun owners radio interview of how certain things impact our behavior, and oftentimes that's found in our drill that that illustrates the perceived penalty for a miss, right? And so the analogy I have for it is if you just have a pot of regular room temperature water and how we walk with it, right? It's like sure that we might get wet, so we take some precaution, but we're not that worried about it because a perceived penalty of getting wet is not that serious. We might have to clean it up, might wet our skin. And but if that was boiling water, that absolutely changes our
right.
behavior, even though the risk profile didn't change. The risk is the same, right? So it's the same, but the penalty is much higher. And so
Correct.
the impact is very different. And the analogy I used is precision shots, right? Where people like to time how quick and fast they could take that shot. But you add in now the contextual information. Now the pot is boiling, and that boiling pot is now someone has your kid. Right? The
Yeah,
perceived penalty for a miss is much more significant. It's going to impact your behavior and change it entirely. So, how do
correct.
you account for that in the training environment? Right. And the we also have to peel back the layers of how to reliably reflect on the result, the outcome of getting the hit or missing the hit. So a lot of times people take multiple attempts at the same 3-inch circle from the same place, orientation, and distance to the target. That's a false sense of competence because you didn't actually train your body to present the gun and press that trigger on your first
Correct.
attempt. You actually learned from your miss. And in context, the lesson you learn is that the target's no longer there and the opportunity is no longer there. So
Correct.
it's twofold, right? And so taking a lateral step in the direction to your left or right, minimum body width, and new orientation, new presentation. Um, did I say orientation and presentation? I'm not sure what I said there, but when you present to that, it should be a new problem every time, and you only get one attempt. What I mean a new problem is that when you move to the right, that's a new problem that you have to try to calculate and orient and aim, right? And you
Yeah.
take that shot, whether you hit or miss, that problem's gone. You have to change your position, right? And that's the true way to develop competence with some context, right?
Yeah. This is I texted you and Pincus a few weeks ago,
Yeah,
and it was, I think, my poor attempt at trying to like see how prediction error comes into play with this,
yeah,
but
yeah,
I think Pincus noted well enough to say like we're not doing this enough to really create a prediction error, right? Like
yeah.
because of what you just said there, it's a new problem.
Right.
So if it's a new problem, right? Prediction error, for those that may or may not understand or don't understand, the prediction error is really more when your brain has this expectation of something happening.
Yeah.
Your wife cooks you steak every day at 5 p.m. all the time, and then all of a sudden that steak's not fucking there at 5 p.m. one day. That your dopamine reacts to
Yeah.
that change.
Yeah.
So it doesn't kind of work the completely because of what you just said there. Like the problem needs to be different all the time.
Yes.
Um, yeah,
And supporting that point, the entire intuitive defensive program is founded on the unexpected. So quite the
yeah,
opposite. We try to have less predictability, less anticipation. Although anticipation, so this is another aspect, right? I don't want to discount anticipation too much because anticipation absolutely helps, but recognition is a different way to compensate for lack of anticipation. And
yeah,
so having recognition can help you respond efficiently, but doing things like advanced work, what I mean by that is becoming familiar with stimuli, becoming familiar with threat indicators, becoming
correct.
familiar with behavioral patterns, becoming familiar with crime patterns in certain neighborhoods. Those are all things that can help with being able to be prepared before something happens. But the
Yeah,
worst case scenario is when you didn't expect something to happen, especially if you can't process how it's happening. One of my favorite I call it a case study, is the Chanel fight against Anderson Silva. Highly trained athletes, both highly trained athletes, highly trained martial artists, but Chanel couldn't uh, process how Anderson Silva was constantly punching him in the face. Right? So he's a
yeah,
great wrestler, but the way that Anderson Silva's depth perception was manipulating the distance and the body language, he couldn't read the body language. And there's a point where the startle reaction started kicking in. I think it was round two, where consistently he kept doing this, literally turning his head and getting here.
yeah,
Highly trained athlete, highly prepared, lots of anticipation, but because his brain couldn't process how it was happening, the override kicked in. And the startle reaction is the override when you didn't expect it and you can't process it, right? And so,
yeah. This
the,
is what I try and tell people a lot is this stuff right here, the stuff that's in on the screen right now. For those of you guys watching, is part of the your nervous system, and that's a sympathetic thing. It's not a very high level cognitive thing. This happens. I was watching a neuroscientist talk about this, and the way she explained it is the lizard brain's going to win all the fucking time. It wins every single time. Your cortex loses to the lizard brain all the fucking time. So it's interesting that you bring that up because a lot of people are trying to say, well, I'm a boxer and I'm a martial artist and this is what we do. I'm like, yeah, in a choreographed, staged environment.
yeah,
Once they take away, I just did a video about a swimmer who they put him in they wanted him to swim in some really thick mud like substance to see how it affected his performance, and he couldn't do it.
yep,
He said, I'm so used to a very 90-degree water.
yeah,
I'm used to watching a black line and I follow a black line. And
yeah,
you took all of that away. I don't know what
yeah.
the fuck to do.
That's it. And that's exactly what I would say to the boxer is that kind of hubris, that line of thinking is being confident that everything is going to go your way.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And the nature of defensive shooting is that it's definitely not the day that's going your way. Right.
Correct.
It's not going your way. And so if you're really talking about training for worst case scenarios, we need to figure out how to transition from that starter reaction into a skillful response. Right. And how do we account for the unexpected and how do we process the unknown? How well can our brain process that information? And
Yeah.
again, it comes down to your ability to process information, comes down to psychology and your ability to process emotion. Highly recommend everybody go check out Jake Weskerchan from Walk to Talk America, put up emotional functioning and talking about the nervous system and how things happen faster than your conscious awareness. Again, our emotions, they'll detect the change in your environment before we do. And so a lot of times we'll feel a certain way without knowing why. Right. And so later in life, if we don't actually unpack all that, if we don't know what emotional functioning is, then we just kind of bury it. And then when something resembles that trigger, we call it being triggered. Right. When we get angry at something or there's certain behavior about, I don't like that guy because he acts a
Yeah.
certain way. And but you don't know why. Right. So that's oftentimes some deeper level, maybe trauma, maybe not trauma, but maybe something happened in your brain that you didn't process and figure out. But under duress, especially under life-threatening violence, you got to figure it out.
Correct.
And so that's not something that we can help students with on the range, other than directing them to emotional functioning and encouraging them to really understand what each emotion is, the utility of emotion, because we were raised in a society that taught us that emotions are bad and intelligence is good. But
Correct.
you know what you talked about earlier about the amygdala, a lot of people refer to it the lizard brain. I personally like to keep everything human. I'm not a big sheepdog guy because humans are capable of being completely evil or completely good, completely apathetic and
Yeah.
sociopathic, or completely compassionate and sympathetic. It's humans, it's us, it's what we do. And part of what we do is we have this amygdala that can override because it says, okay, you're failing at your functions, higher order thinking. I have to protect the body now, and we have this default mode network, and kind of going back to what we were talking about with automated versus automatic and how the
Yeah.
nervous system works. We have schemas in our brain, and so when I think fork, your brain already categorizes different things, either stabby stuff to stab food or people or whatever, right? But you kind of
Correct.
have associations with that schematic.
Yeah.
And so there is a deeper level of programming, and Pincus is a genius. The more I dig into the stuff, the more I see how well organized the curriculum is. But
Yeah. A lot of people undervalue that, and he'll admit it himself. He'll tell you, I didn't come up with this shit. Like it's not like he
yeah,
created fucking neuroscience. It's not the
right,
it
right,
just, but people undermine
yeah,
how well he thought about how this needs to go, right? And
yes,
he's seen the differences. But this program, the one that you and I are part of, it has its roots in Navy Special Warfare and
hmm
Special Forces and all that shit, and then it evolved into the civilian side of it. So he knows the differences between the attacker, because
hmm
let's be honest, military is more attacker,
yep,
to us the defender.
yeah.
Uh,
The predatory state versus being in a prey role,
correct.
and how well can we spawn from the prey position, right? A
Yeah.
lot of us don't want to think ourselves as victims, right?
Yeah.
But the reality is, if you have to use your gun, you're now a victim of a violent crime,
Correct.
right? It's just, yeah, we don't have to allow our ego to get in the way.
Correct.
That there's another aspect of adrenaline that happens aside from tachycardia, I mean slow motion time, or
Yeah.
tachychronia. I'm sorry, bradychronia, where time slows down.
Slows down.
Yeah. The other aspect is bradycyclia, where your brain slows down, and tachychronia, where time speeds up. And the opposite analogy there is like pressing fast forward on a video and you're getting frame drops, right?
Yeah.
Oftentimes that can serve to protect the ego. So can dissociation. So sometimes, like a lot of kids that are victims of child abuse will start to dissociate, or even rape, right? Where they see an event happening to them, and it's a way that the ego protects itself from
Yeah.
trying to, and a it's a life or death thing where the
Correct.
lizard
This is
brain
I
overrides.
argue this a lot, and I want to ask you this,
Yeah,
and maybe as we wind down here, and I'm only gonna try and keep it to an hour ish
yeah,
because it's a lot of
it
information.
is. Yeah,
It's a lot of information. I want to have you back on and
cool.
talk about this some more because it's such an awesome thing. But I think in the interest of people absorbing it well, I think in smaller chunks is probably better. But anyways, is I argue this from a place of ignorance, and I have to be honest about this. Everything that I've studied doesn't support the idea of freeze, right? We always talk fight, fight, or freeze,
hmm
and everything I've studied, and I don't know what you have information for as far as this is concerned, but there is no freeze. Again, correct me if I'm wrong. There
hmm
is no freeze. It's really your brain is either wanting you to not do shit because that's what it thinks it's the best way to survive,
Yeah.
or it doesn't know what the fuck to do. There's
Yes.
nothing in the wires to tell
Yes.
it what the fuck to do in that context.
Yeah. Usually it's both, and it's usually coupled with dissociation. So it's a
Yeah,
part of the brain that just it can't process what's happening. So if you ever watch an active shooting, right, the first shots that fire, it's contrary to what we think would happen. We think most people would
correct.
start running and screaming. What often happens is people go, "What's that?" I
Correct.
guess it was nothing, and then shooting keeps happening. What's going on? People are screaming. People that are proximal to the shooting start running, and people are still in denial.
There's an
Right?
accidental discharge at a gun store.
Yeah.
If you go YouTube that, it kind of shows exactly what Mike is talking about. Somebody has an accidental discharge. I think it might have even been at a range, it happens, and everybody just kind of looks around. Everybody with guns there. Nobody drew a gun.
Yeah,
Nobody did
yeah.
any of that shit. They just heard gunshots where they weren't supposed to be any gunshots. And what people did was like, they did the startle, and then they looked around like, "What the fuck?"
Yeah,
And
yeah,
that's it. That was
yeah,
their reaction to hearing gunshots.
yeah.
Uh,
So the freeze aspect is also known as fawning. That's what some deers tend to do,
yeah,
and essentially, it's the brain can't process what you do. It's never seen that before. It can't accept that it's a reality. The the freeze, I think, is a loose term to describe a
correct.
glitch in the brain, right?
Yeah,
And then it might determine that death is inevitable. And so now we just need to protect the ego from the dying process. And
that's
it'll start to
interesting.
dissociate and start to see it from a third person perspective. And so the physical manifestation of freezing is more of the perception now witnessing it to the happening to the body. And so the perception part is now a spectator and the body's just not doing anything. Right. And so
Huh.
um, an
So
amazing
this
thing,
is your lizard brain coming to terms that you're about to fucking kick the bucket.
it cataloged through the brain either something in the genetic line embedded through epigenetics that this is absolute death as a result. So just take it,
Huh.
just go with it. Or there's just nothing in the catalogs that there's any solution. Or I mean, it's complex. I'm oversimplifying it.
Correct.
It could also be that like
Correct. And that's the problem with a lot
yeah,
of this. And this is the issue with having this conversation. This is why we need to have this again.
yeah,
I'm going to force you to do this again. It is because it is super complex. We're talking about a very and I think this is why a lot of students have a hard time absorbing this, is because it's not easy. It's not just hit start on a timer and then fucking shoot as fast as you can, because that's easy.
yeah, yeah,
The brain can say, "Oh, I was fast here and I was slow here," but like that's not the way it really is.
right,
The world, life is much more complex than just very superficial athletic shit.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. And something I'd like to come back and talk about is the exogenous interventions that can help with training that's outside of the scope of practice and intuitive defensive shooting. This is more we're going to talk about dissociation, right? TCCC's tactical casualty combat care. They used to hit people with morphine. Morphine's bad. Okay, don't do
yeah.
morphine. Okay, but they replaced it with ketamine, and coincidentally, what they started seeing is a reduction of PTSD for people who have lost their limbs. Essentially,
Huh.
what has happened with ketamine is it's actually dissociative. So they start to
Uh,
perceive all the medical treatment that's happening as a witness, as a spectator, and not that it's happening directly to them. And so that survival negative can be a mental health positive, right? If you survive the event. Uh,
correct.
and so that's one
Huh.
of those functions. And so there's certain exogenous things we can do to rewire the brain. When we talk about PTS, when we talk
Correct.
about TBI, traumatic brain injury, when we talk about Alzheimer's, dementia, brain function. When it going
Yeah.
back to the Street Fighter analogy and untapping, okay, what does Rio superpower? What can he do? What can Guile do? What can Zangief do? Understanding how the brain functions and understanding what's happening outside of our box of the shooting industry,
Correct.
and then kind of bringing it back and seeing what can actually help with people's ability to apply skill. Because sometimes I get students who are victims of violence that like it's too overwhelming for them,
Yeah.
right? And so how can we help that student? Often it's like, oh, you got to go figure it out, right? But
Correct.
outside of class, there are certain things that may help them. We can expose them to certain modalities that may or may not help them. That'll be a whole other thing when we come back to
Yeah.
it, but
Yeah, I think
yeah,
this is a good starting point for hopefully many, many more podcasts. I've been wanting to have you on. It's just time
yeah,
and all that stuff. You're busy. You're on your way to Puerto Rico, right?
yeah,
With Pincus.
yeah,
I'm
with the
kind of
heat wave.
I'm kind of jealous that he didn't invite me.
Well, to be
But
fair, I made a mistake on something, and so now I have to like I'm going to learn today. So it's one of those things where like I had to throw money at my mistake, my problem, so I could be a better
got
instructor.
it.
And so, it's
See,
just
this is what I love about our little small crew. we post something, and
Hmm.
now I'm starting to understand what the fuck is going on here. We post something,
Yep.
and then we'll get a text, and you're like, "What the fuck is this?" And then we're like, "But it's because no, what the fuck is this? Like,
Right.
obviously, you're missing something."
Yes.
Um,
Yep. Yep.
so I get it. Now I don't want to be invited to,
You know,
and it's us making each other better.
absolutely. That's
It's us making each other better. We don't have to be afraid of it.
yeah.
We check each other, sometimes publicly, sometimes in private,
Yeah.
and I
Yeah.
think that's a benefit of being part of our instructor group,
Yeah.
under the banner of ICE training. And because what matters is the program, right?
Yeah.
It's not you, it's not me, it's not Pinkas really.
Yep.
It's
And
the information that we're giving students, and it kind of has to be correct.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. And we do need to check each other. I mean, that it's kind of like, do you want a friend that will ignore the booger on your nose while you're on your hot date?
correct,
Or do you want someone to say, hey, dude, you got a nasty ass booger on your nose. Do you want
correct,
to wipe that off? You know what I mean?
correct.
So
Yeah,
the
and you're gonna be
account,
embarrassed for a little bit, but it's
yeah.
you lick your wounds.
And it's one of
Yeah,
those things where you have to have more passion for learning than your feelings.
correct,
You know what I mean? And so there's
correct.
like a certain level of integrity. It's like, crap, I thought it was this way. I must have a blind side. Right.
Yeah,
So I got to go figure that out. I got to remediate that. And it's
correct.
one of those urgent things for me personally. It's like, I hate making mistakes, because
Well,
I
for,
typically try to take a long time before I say anything publicly.
yeah,
And so if I drop the ball on something, it's like, oh God, how was I not aware?
correct.
I have to fix that. You know what I
Well,
mean?
Puerto Rico's seems like a nice place to go learn.
Absolutely is. I had the choice between that and Massachusetts.
Yeah, yeah, no, I understand your choice.
Yeah.
So I appreciate your time, man.
Yeah. Thank you for having me
We'll
on,
have you
man.
back on,
Yeah.
and maybe soon. This is open, so whenever you want to do this again, as soon as you want to again. I'm only doing this in short spurts,
Yep.
for people to kind of have, you know how the brain works,
Yeah.
shorter videos
Yeah.
ish. I mean,
Yeah.
so, but I appreciate your time. I think this is a good starting point for you and I. Give us more stuff to reflect on, and maybe talk about more stuff later on. But I
But
appreciate you coming on.
thank you, man. And I'm hoping that you get some feedback from the audience, because there's a
Yeah.
lot going on in my head. Um, haven't really organized it,
No,
want to make sure.
I think you and I may
Yeah.
benefit from having Isaac with us next time,
Okay.
because I think you and I think the process shit the same. We just say shit. We just fucking we just
Yeah.
rah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm trying to hold back on all that stuff. So
Yeah.
again,
Yeah.
I appreciate you, man.